The unholy trinity of Hitler, Stalin and Mao are the modern era's most brutal and deadly rulers. Unfortunately, history shows that brutal rulers are one of the few things that humanity has never lacked. Some, such as Attila the Hun and Genghis Khan, were warlords and great conquerors who brutalized the recently vanquished. Others were too timid to go to war, made no conquests whatsoever, and simply brutalized their own people at home. Below are 20 things about some of history's most brutal rulers. A brutal king who kept his enemies close, real close. Ever heard the saying, keep your friends close, and your enemies even closer? Well, King Ferdinand I of Naples, who ruled from 1458 until his death, took that line of reasoning and ran with it to irrational extremes. By all accounts, Ferdinand was a capable ruler who brought peace and prosperity to his realm. Through diplomacy and strategic marriages, he created a dense network of interlocking friendships and alliances with other sovereigns. It made him so influential that he was nicknamed the Judge of Italy. He was also a generous patron of the arts, and was an important figure in the Italian Renaissance. That was the good side of Ferdinand. On the bad side, politics in Italy back then was not a professional fit for the squeamish. The Italian peninsula was a jumble of various small states and independent cities, teetering on the brink of anarchy as rival aristocratic families fiercely competed for power and prestige. Betrayals, poisonings, assassinations, and wars were a commonplace, in what amounted to a real-life version of Game of Thrones minus the dragons. Ferdinand had a brutal side that allowed him to thrive in such an environment. Remember that part about keeping enemies close? As seen below, after he disposed of his enemies, Ferdinand kept their corpses on exhibit in what came to be known as the Museum of Mummies. You did not want to accept an invitation from Ferdinand I of Naples. Ferdinand I of Naples was not the forgiving sort. As one historian put it, his pleasures were of two kinds. He liked to have his opponents near him, either alive in well-guarded prisons, or dead in embalmed dress in the costume which they wore in their lifetime. In 1465, Ferdinand defeated a rebellion by his barons in the guise of forgiveness. He invited several former foes and their families to a celebration, then arrested them when they showed up. Some were locked up for decades and others were exterminated. The victims included one who fell to his death after Ferdinand pushed him out of a window. One might think that afterward, nobody who had ever angered Ferdinand would accept an invitation from him. If so, one would be wrong. On another occasion, some who had offended Ferdinand attended a wedding celebration at the king's residence, the Castel Nuovo. At the height of the merriment, they were suddenly arrested and whisked to the dungeons for torture, a death sentence at a quick trial and execution. As seen below, the brutal king liked to put his dead enemies on display. The Brutal King of Naples Museum of Mummies. Ferdinand I of Naples was not satisfied with simply offing his enemies. He wanted to turn them and their fates into public examples and cautionary lessons to deter others from even thinking about betrayal. After he had them taken care of, the King of Naples ordered that the bodies of his enemies be mummified. He then put them on display in an exhibit hall in the Castel Nuovo, which he referred to as his Black Museum, and which came to be commonly known as the Museum of Mummies. As a contemporary historian described the exhibit, these dried cadavers were displayed pickled with herbs, a frightful sight, in the dress they wore when alive and with the same ornaments, so that by this terrible example of tyranny those who did not wish to be similarly served might be properly afraid. Ferdinand liked to conduct personal tours of his macabre museum, which often served as an effective deterrent to those contemplating treason. To mix things up and keep them interesting, the king's mummified enemies were sometimes propped up in mock banquets. China's most brutal emperor. Qin Shi Huangdi, whose name means first emperor of Qin, started off as king of the Chinese state of Qin, one of several rival kingdoms in China's Warring States period. He ascended the throne as a child and in his teens wrested power from the regents and courtiers who had governed during his minority. The young monarch then consolidated his power with a massacre of palace plotters who sought to usurp his prerogatives. He then went on the warpath. He pushed back the northern barbarians, defeated and conquered all other Chinese states by 221 BC, and consolidated them under his rule. He then declared himself the first emperor of China. Qin Shi Huang pulled off the impressive task of ending the chaotic feudalism that had prevailed in China for over 5 centuries. In its place was now a unified, peaceful, and efficiently governed centralized state. Unification, pacification, and efficiency came at a high price, however. Tyranny and great oppression as a result. Despite Qin Shi Huang's key role in China's foundation, he was greatly abhorred by most Chinese because of his brutal behavior. A brutal legal system for a brutal ruler. Qin Shi Huang's most trusted and influential official was his Minister of Justice Li Shu. In addition to being a bureaucrat, Li Shu was also a philosopher who followed a school of thought known as legalism. It advocated strict laws and draconian punishments for even petty crimes. As Li Shu put it, if light offenses carry heavy punishments, one can imagine what will be done against a serious offense, thus the people will not dare to break the laws. Such brutal logic was music to the ears of the brutal first emperor. Criticism of the law became a capital offense, and cowed citizens were expected to inform their neighbors. Then, with unchecked power and the resources of an entire empire to draw upon, Qin Shi Huang grew megalomaniacal and launched huge projects with massive amounts of forced labor. One such project had 700,000 laborers toil on the first emperor's tomb for 30 years. The famous terracotta warriors site, discovered in the 1970s and now open to tourism with its thousands of life-size statues, is but a fraction of his gigantic tomb complex. The bulk of it is yet to be unearthed. Millions more labored to dig canals, level hills, make roads and build over 700 palaces. The biggest project of all was the Great Wall of China, which did double duty, keeping the northern barbarians out, and keeping the Chinese seeking to flee the emperor's onerous taxation and oppressive rule in. A departure from Chinese reverence for scholars. The Warring States period had been a period of chaos, however it had also been a golden age of Chinese philosophy and free thinking. The centuries before China's unification in 221 BC came to be known as the 100 Schools of Thought. It was an era in which various philosophies, such as Confucianism and Taoism, emerged and were freely debated. The first emperor brought that to an end by banning all schools of thoughts, except legalism. He saw his new state as a radical break from the past. To emphasize that break, as well as to keep his subjects from pining for bygone days, he ordered that all history books in China be burned. Qin Shi Huang also ordered the burning of books on philosophy and every other subject except for agriculture, science and magic. When scholars protested, they discovered just how brutal he could get. Until then, intellectuals and scholars had been revered figures, highly respected by China's rulers. Qin Shi Huang was cut from a different cloth. He ordered 460 scholars buried alive. What the first emperor was most interested in was immortality through a life elixir. But his quest for immortality backfired. It was not only that all his efforts to find a life elixir failed, as they were bound to do, it was that those insane attempts at living forever did the opposite, and shortened the life of China's first emperor. A quest for immortality that backfired. In pursuit of immortality, Qin Shi Huang solicited the advice and assistance of numerous philosophers, alchemists, opportunists, sketchy characters and outright charlatans. One of them gave the first emperor mercury pills, which he claimed were a life-prolonging intermediate step in his research for immortality drugs. Using them every day should tide Qin Shi Huang over until the life elixir was ready. Qin Shi Huang swallowed mercury every day, gradually poisoned himself and gradually grew insane. He turned into a recluse who concealed himself from all but his closest courtiers, and spent much of his time listening to songs about pure beings. Many of the first emperor's crazier and more brutal decisions, such as the burial of scholars and burning of books, were probably caused by the mercury pills. Rather than prolong his life, Qin Shi Huang gave himself a nasty dose of mercury poisoning. It made him literally crazy, and finished him off at the relatively young age of 49. It happened during one of his tours of the provinces, when he dropped dead inside his spacious imperial carriage, a miniature house on wheels, on September 10, 210 BC. Ottoman sultans were brutal towards their own kin. Many kingdoms collapsed into chaos, and many ruling dynasties vanished into the dustbin of history, because of infighting by royal siblings competing for the throne. The early Ottoman Turks tackled that problem head-on, with one of the most brutal and ruthless solutions possible. As soon as a new Ottoman sultan ascended the throne, he immediately executed all his brothers. The prospects of deadly rivalries and civil wars were thus eliminated by the simple expedient of eliminating all potential male claimants to the throne. The early Ottomans had no clear-cut rules of succession. When princes reached puberty, their father the Sultan sent them out to govern a province. There they would establish a power base of ambitious followers, eager to prosper by urging their royal governor to make a bid for the throne upon his father's death. Thus the death of a sultan was usually followed by a civil war between his sons, and a new sultan's early reign was often marked by the revolts of envious brothers seeking to replace him. Eventually Sultan Mehmed II the Conqueror enacted a law of governance that stated in relevant part, "Any of my sons who ascends the throne, it is acceptable for him to kill his brothers for the common benefit of the people. The majority of the ulama Muslim scholars approve this. Let action be taken accordingly. The day the Ottoman Empire wept. Mehmed II's successors usually heeded his advice to maintain the realm's stability by preemptively executing their brothers as soon as they ascended the throne. It was a cruel expedient, but it worked. For the next 2 centuries, the Ottoman Empire was remarkably stable and free of infighting and civil wars. When compared to its contemporaries, however, although the system worked, many consciences were bothered by the extermination of innocent royal siblings at the start of each reign. Those misgivings reached a peak when Sultan Mehmed III inaugurated his reign by strangling to death his 19 brothers, some of them mere infants. It was said that the empire wept, as a long line of child-sized coffins exited the palace in a grand procession the next day. Eventually a reaction set in against the brutal tradition of fratricide, and a new tradition took its place. Instead of new sultans disposing of their brothers when they ascended the throne, they simply locked them up. Thus was born the system of the Ottoman kafs or cage, whereby sultans set up a secluded part of their royal harem as a detention center for their brothers. Their potential rivals were kept under house arrest, under surveillance by palace guards, and isolated from the outside world to prevent intrigues and plots. Life in the kafs could be rough, but for those living in it, the very fact that they were still living at all meant that it beat the alternative. A brutal and sadistic sultan. Unlike many of his predecessors, Ottoman Sultan Murad IV did not do away with his brothers when he ascended the throne. Instead, he locked them up inside his harem in the kafs or cage. The kaf system was set up as a more merciful alternative to how prior generations of Ottoman sultans had dealt with their brothers. However, it might not have been much mercy in Murad's case. All things considered, many of his imprisoned siblings might have wished that Murad had simply gone ahead and executed them at the start of his reign. For Murad IV was a brutal figure who combined paranoia with sadism. He constantly suspected his captive brothers of plotting against him, and constantly tried to entrap them into saying any careless old thing that could validate his suspicions. Murad sent seemingly sympathetic guards or servants to try and draw out this or that imprisoned brother into uttering anything that could even remotely be interpreted as treasonous. Any slip of the tongue could result in an imprisoned sibling getting accused of plotting against the Sultan, who was just itching for an excuse to execute his brothers. That eagerness to shed blood was no surprise, considering that Murad's entertainment included shooting arrows to take care of any unwary fisherman whose boats drifted too close to his seaside palace. The romantic side of a brutal dictator. Saddam Hussein, also known as the Butcher of Baghdad, ruled Iraq from 1979 until his ouster in the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. His years in power were marked by extreme brutality, oppression and corruption at home, plus costly and failed wars against his neighbors, and a variety of purges and genocides against domestic opponents. Real or suspected at least 250,000 Iraqis were exterminated by Saddam's security services. Hundreds of thousands more Iraqis did not make it through Saddam's invasions of Iran and Kuwait. However, the brutal Iraqi tyrant seems to have had a maudlin streak. When not engaged in the wholesale extermination of his people or getting them into wars, Saddam liked to write steamy romance novels. During his years in power, Saddam wrote at least 4 novels and a number of poems and poetry collections. Of his novels, Zabiba and the King is the best known and the most widely lampooned. It was adapted by Sacha Baron Cohen in his 2012 comedy, The Dictator. Saddam Hussein's Maudlin love story. Zabiba and the King, a convoluted love story, was written in 2000 and set in Saddam Hussein's hometown of Tikrit in the 7th or 8th century AD. The main characters are Zabiba, a beautiful commoner, her perverted and cruel husband, and a powerful and handsome ruler named Hussein. Each night the stunningly beautiful and brilliant Zabiba is summoned to Hussein's palace. Borrowing from Arabian Nights, she fobs him off of feasting on her succulent body by giving long political speeches. Inevitably, Hussein's attention wanders from Zabiba's mind to her hot body, and he develops an unquenchable lust for her. Her perverted husband, fond of orgies and money and deviant explicit practices, is unhappy with the developing relationship between his wife and King Hussein, so hubby disguises himself and assaults Zabiba as she walks home from the palace one night. It was a means of shaming her that makes sense, within the cultural context of Iraqi tribal society and honor code. Hussein, however, loves Zabiba too much to let the shame destroy the romance, so he goes after the perpetrator, After a series of adventures, Zabibah leads an army, is mortally wounded in battle, and dies while proclaiming Arab nationalism with her last breath. Hussein goes on to capture and exterminate the perpetrator, and thus avenges Zabibah's honor. Iraqi critics' reaction to Saddam Hussein's novel was unsurprising. Saddam Hussein was not exactly what one would call a subtle writer. Zabibah and the King was intended as a ham-fisted allegory, with the hints driven home as if by a sledgehammer. Zabibah represents the Iraqi people, the husband represents the U.S., the assault represents America's ouster of Iraq from Kuwait in 1991, and is dated January 17, the same date as the commencement of Operation Desert Storm. The powerful and heroic King Hussein represents Saddam Hussein. Unsurprisingly, no Iraqi critic dared criticize a novel that, despite a token effort at a pseudonym, everybody knew was written by the country's brutal dictator. They lauded Zabibah and the King to the skies, showered it with praise and declared that it was a world-class literary breakthrough. The novel became a domestic bestseller, and over 1 million copies flew off the shelves. Saddam's sycophants in the Iraqi Ministry of Information turned the novel into a 20-part television series that aired on and was frequently rerun on Iraqi TV. A musical was produced as well. Libya's weird dictator. Muammar al-Gaddafi was the self-declared, brotherly leader and guide of the 1st of September Great Revolution of the great socialist people's Libyan Arab Jamahiriya. As a young army colonel, he overthrew the Libyan monarchy in a 1969 military coup. He then became the country's brutal dictator, until his overthrow and death in a popular uprising in 2011, called the Mad Dog of the Middle East, by U.S. President Ronald Reagan, just before sending jets to bomb him. Gaddafi's 42-year reign was marked by dramatic twists and turns. He morphed from socialism to Islamic fundamentalism. Once a key sponsor of terrorism, he became an avid cooperator in the global war on terror. He started off as an Arab nationalist, only to eventually revile Arabs and turn to African nationalism instead. Gaddafi saw himself as a messiah. He modeled himself on Chairman Mao, and published the Little Green Book, which contained a political philosophy labeled the Third International Theory, a cockamamie mix of direct democracy, Arab and African nationalism, and Islamic socialism. It was intended as an alternative to capitalism and communism. Gaddafi's book became required reading for Libyans, and it formed the theoretical basis of the country's government. In reality, Libya was a kleptocratic dictatorship, governed on the basis of nepotism to enrich Gaddafi's family and his tribe. It had a grossly mismanaged economy that survived only because of abundant oil and gas. Beneath the weird, lurked a brutal tyrant. A creepy womanizer, Muammar al-Gaddafi often hit on female reporters. He frequently met them for interviews in bathrobes or in his underwear. He became obsessed with former U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, and referred to her as his darling black African woman. He showered her during a visit to Tripoli with $212,000 worth of gifts, including a lute and a locket with his picture inside. He also saw himself as a fashion icon, and to that end cultivated an odd collection of ensembles and sartorial choices that made him modern history's most bizarrely dressed ruler. Changing in and out of silly uniforms multiple times a day, it was the closest real-life depiction of a James Bond villain. The cartoonish villain look was further enhanced by his all-virgin female bodyguard, officially named the Revolutionary Nuns, but known more commonly as the Amazonian Guard. Beneath the buffoonish look and cuckoo philosophy, however, was a brutal dictator. Gaddafi's regime engaged in massive repression, torture, extermination of individuals, and human rights violations. Among his vices was the habit of ordering women kidnapped off the street, including teenage girls, and taken to one of his many palaces. At least one of his victims was kept imprisoned in his basement for 6 years. He forced her to watch pornography while snorting cocaine with him, and repeatedly assaulted her, urinated on her, and subjected her to sundry perversions. He was finally overthrown in a revolt in 2011 and captured by rebels, who tortured and likely explicitly assaulted Gaddafi before executing him. Russia's second most brutal ruler. Of Russia's many brutal rulers, few, with the possible exception of Stalin, were more brutal than Tsar Ivan IV. Better known as Ivan the Terrible, he was the Grand Prince of Moscow from 1533 to 1547. That year he declared himself Tsar of all the Russias, which became the title of Russian monarch from then on. He created a centralized government and was a grand conqueror, who finally overthrew the last remnants of Mongol subjugation beneath which Russia had grown for centuries. Ivan then proceeded to subjugate the neighboring nomadic khanates and greatly expanded Russia's borders. All of that was good and laudable from a Russian perspective. On the other hand, however, Ivan was an insanely cruel despot who subjected his people to a decades-long reign of terror. As seen below, his long list of atrocities included the massacre of entire cities and the implementation of a state policy that revolved around mass repression. In a fit of rage, he even personally disposed of his own son. As a child, this tyrant used to torture small animals. Ivan the Terrible ascended the throne of the Grand Duchy of Moscow when he was 3 years old, and his mother governed as regent in his name. However, she died when Ivan was 7, and a power struggle erupted between rival boyars or Russian nobles, in which the child Ivan was left defenseless. He was exploited and tormented by boyars, who mistreated and abused him in his own palace, and made him bitter, and bitterness gave way to insanity. Before long, he began to vent his frustrations by torturing small animals. By the time he took personal control of the government, Ivan was a paranoid, resentful and angry young man. He distrusted people in general and detested the boyar class in particular, so he instituted a system known as the Oprichnina in the 1560s that amounted to a reign of terror. It augured the absolute monarchy that was to be Russia's hallmark for centuries to come. With a special police force, the Oprichniki, Ivan kicked off a wave of brutal persecutions that targeted the boyars and spread from there in ever greater ripples that soon covered all his lands. A Tsar who eliminated his own son. Ivan the Terrible's most infamous atrocity occurred in Novgorod in 1570 when that city defied him. He marched on it in the dead of winter, and after seizing it, indulged in violent depravity. He started off with the clergy, whom he rounded up and ordered flogged from dawn until dusk, for days on end, until they each paid a 20-ruble fine. Hundreds died, and afterward he ordered the survivors executed. The population fared no better. He ordered the torture of leading citizens along with their families. Men were executed and women and children were bound and thrown into a nearby river. There they were trapped under the ice as soldiers patrolled the area on foot, with hooks and spears to push down any who surfaced. By the time Ivan was finally sated, over 60,000 had perished. Even his own family was not spared. Ivan's fits of uncontrollable rage. In 1581 he assaulted his pregnant daughter-in-law when he saw her wearing clothes that he deemed too skimpy, and caused her to miscarry. When his son and heir angrily berated him for the brutal attack on his wife, Ivan the Terrible smashed his head in with his scepter. The result was a fatal wound from which the Tsar's son died a few days later. He followed him 3 years later, and died from a stroke while playing chess. The Brutal Hun. Attila the Hun, a brutal nomadic warlord, ruled a multi-tribal empire dominated by the Huns that spanned Eastern and Central Europe. During his reign 434 to 453, he earned the moniker the Scourge of God. As he terrified the civilized world, he attacked Persia, terrorized the Eastern and Western Roman empires, plundered the Balkans, and extorted vast sums of gold from Constantinople. He next invaded Gaul and was beaten back, recoiled, then struck into Italy the following year, before he finally drank himself to death on his wedding night. Attila was born in the Hungarian steppe in 406 into the Hun royal family, and inherited the crown jointly with his brother Bleda in 434. The brothers were challenged early on but crushed the opposition. When their surviving enemies fled to the Roman Empire, the brothers invaded. They forced the Romans to surrender the fugitives and agree to an annual tribute of 230 kilograms of gold. Attila and Bleda then turned their attention to the Persian Empire, which they invaded and plundered for years before they were beaten, so then they returned their attention to Europe. A poetically apt death for a tyrant. In 440 Attila and Bleda crossed the Danube, proceeded to plunder the Balkans, and destroyed 2 Roman armies while they were at it. The Roman emperor admitted defeat, and the brothers extorted from him a new treaty that paid 2,000 gold kilograms upfront, plus an annual tribute of 700 gold kgs. Soon thereafter Attila consolidated power by unaliving his brother, and became the sole ruler. In 447 he returned to the Balkans and ravaged them, until he reached the walls of Constantinople, before recoiling. The next chapter in Attila's brutal tale began in 450, when the Western Roman Emperor's sister sought to escape an undesired betrothal by begging Attila's help. Along with her message, she sent him her engagement ring. Attila interpreted that as a marriage proposal, accepted, and asked for half of the Western Roman Empire as dowry. When the Romans balked, Attila invaded and visited his customary brutal devastation, before he was finally defeated at the Battle of the Catalanian Fields in 451. The next year he invaded Italy, and sacked and plundered as he advanced down the peninsula. Before he was persuaded by the Pope to withdraw, he planned to attack Constantinople again in 453, but his rampage finally ended that year. He drank himself into a stupor while celebrating his wedding to a new wife, suffered a nosebleed and choked to death on his own blood.